Hi, everyone. This is Melanie Yazzie. We're back with another episode of Red Power Hour. And me and Elena, we have been reunited. Um, I don't think you and I have sat down to record an episode since early January, right?
Yep,
Dang. Are you feeling better?
I am. I'm still dealing with this asthma thing, which was a parting gift from my last bout with COVID. And as I am incredibly fortunate to have good insurance, I'm waiting on my insurance to hopefully approve a biologic drug, which will take care of all of my asthma, which is right now um, uncontrolled. I would like to control it.
Yeah, I recorded our last RPH episode with Justine a couple of weeks ago, and I was talking about the reason why you and I hadn't recorded in quite some time was COVID, like just getting sick and like the aftermath of COVID. So thanks for being on here. I can actually hear it in your voice. Like you're kind of like the diminished lung capacity. So thanks for being here. It's hard to talk for an hour, like when you don't have full lung capacity.
It is, and it's been a real lesson in slowing down and recognizing my own limitations, which is something that I'm not very good at. So yeah, it's been a lesson in humility, and I'm going to look at it to be grateful for the lesson.
Word. I have also been experiencing that same lesson. My body really stopping me in my tracks. But I'm glad that we're actually able to be here to do this. We're going to do something a bit of a softball episode today. We aren't going to do any hard hitting political analysis. I mean, unless we do hard hitting political analysis of Dune. But yeah, we're going to do just a breakdown about Dune 2. I'm sure many people have seen it. It was very anticipated, or Dune Part 2. It came out like about 3 weeks ago, a month ago, something like that. Uh, Elena and I, being nerds, obviously saw it and have a lot to say about it. And I think it's important. So we did an episode. We did an episode 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, after Dune Part 1 came out. So that came out in October of 2021. So we did an episode on that at that time. And so we felt like it would be appropriate to do an episode on Dune Part 2, which continues a lot of like the weird imperial and colonial problems with the depictions in the narrative. But yeah, so that's what we're going to talk about today.
Yep. And like a total geek, and the first book actually came out. This is going to date me. The first book came out the year I was born. So when I read the books when I was in high school, because I read everything science fiction fantasy, I was really enamored of the books. I was young, I was not politicized, I was just sort of a geek. And um, as I got older, and particularly the first horrible film, David Lynch film, came out when I was just out of high school, and it was so bad as to be comical, with Sting in his gold underwear.
Sting!
Um,
I
but,
forgot Sting was in the original one.
yep, yep, and I just was beginning to be able to read more into films than just sit there and go, ooh. So there was a lot in that first David Lynch film that um, that I learned, particularly about Frank Herbert, who was a homophobe. He had a gay son who he disowned, and so a lot of that homophobia and real internalized anger came out in the characters of Baron Harkonnen and Fade Routha, and how that has changed from that original film to this series, or at least the first two, is interesting. Also, coming that film coming out right at the height of the Cold War, um, and all of these series that we have talked about on Red Power Hour, and the Red Nation podcast, when we talk about Star Wars, when we talk about um, Game of Thrones, any and all of these, um, Lord of the Rings, they're all the same story, and they all have very similar subtexts. And so when we're looking, and then of course our one of my favorite podcasts that we did was the one on Dances with Wolves, and which we called Lawrence of South Dakota. So looking at Dune, this is Lawrence of Arrakis. And for those of you who have never seen or heard of Lawrence of Arabia, like that is the seminal film that you can look through the eyes of that film and see all of these films, particularly with the Orientalist tropes in mind. But Lawrence of Arabia has left a lasting impact on all of this, the white savior trope, and a lot of other things that I think we're going to talk about today. So I'm kind of excited about it.
I have like original paperbacks of Dune. I just haven't read them. And maybe I'm dating myself because I'm about half a generation younger than you, Elena, I think. So Dune wasn't like on my radar when I was a kid, certainly not when I was a teenager in the 90s. It was already passe or whatever. And so as an adult now in my 40s, encountering Dune kind of for the first time in a way. So I grew up on Lord of the Rings, for example, right? Because the very first Lord of the Rings came out in like 2000 or 2001 or something like that. So that was like right in the perfect time uh, for that, or like on Harry Potter, because I think the first Harry Potter movie came out in 2001. So in terms of like the big like blockbuster fantasy films, even Star Wars was kind of coming out when I was a child, but I never really understood Star Wars until the what are the Rogue One series, like the Star Wars stories started coming out about 10 years ago, was when I really got more into Star Wars. So I'm a bit of a dilettante here talking about Dune. I think in conversation with you because it's not something that was like I don't know the lore. I haven't read the books. I'm not like a super fan, you know, in the same way that I probably would be with some of those other the big fantasy stories and movies you talked about. Um, but nevertheless, I'm going to offer my opinion because that's what we do here on Red Power Hour. Uh, and yeah, I rewatched Dune Part One a week before I watched Dune Part Two because I had not. I went to the theaters to see Dune Part One 2.5 years ago, and I like kind of remembered what happened, but I didn't entirely, and I felt like I needed to prepare myself because there was like so much hype around Dune Part Two. So I rewatched Dune Part One, and I was like, "This is a really good movie." It was cinematographically beautiful. I actually, the Orientalism and like the weird kind of colonial and imperial tropes aside that we're going to talk about, I just felt like Dune Part One was just really well done. It was so interesting and like I'm a huge fan of fantasy. Fantasy is like hands down my favorite genre to read for relaxation. It's my favorite genre to watch on TV and film for relaxation. I think a lot of native people really love fantasy and like science fiction. And so I was like really into it. And so I was all hyped when I was going to go see Dune Part Two, which I saw last weekend. I saw it a week ago. And I got to be honest, like I did not like part two as much as part one for a lot of reasons. But yeah, that's just my like introductory assessment um, of Dune Part Two.
Yeah, I thought I actually think both of them are beautifully done, and the cinematography is gorgeous. I think the like I love the desert, and I love the red sands and the cliffs, and to me like that's familiar and comforting. Um, so I don't see it as intimidating that I think a lot of other folks see that as an alien sort of landscape. And I think to us, particularly in the Southwest, like that's home. I mean, that looks like home to me. So I love the way it's shot. I love the ornithopters buzzing around. I think They are so cool. Um, and I even love the shots of Paul in his cape, um, because I think they're beautifully shot. At the same time, half of my brain is going, "Oh, what a gorgeous shot!" He's up there on the dunes, and the other half of my brain is going, "God, white saviorism," like personified. So I have the two brains going. I think that the films are well done, and sort of being faithful to the books. The books are really hard to read, so it doesn't surprise me that a lot of people have not read the books, because they're like Tolkien in that there's a whole history, and both Tolkien and Herbert spent a lot of time creating these worlds before they actually wrote the books. So you're getting the benefit of, years and years of white mansplaining in these books, and then the filmmakers are trying to take that and make it into a cohesive, coherent film. And I think that Denis Villeneuve does a good job of making what can be an incoherent text into a fairly coherent text. But there's a lot of subtext in all of these, and it's very layered and nuanced, and can be, I think, confusing. um, I'm going to have to see Dune 2 again. I did the same thing you did. I saw the first one. I watched the first one the night before we went to see the second one, because I wanted to remind myself what had happened. And the second one literally starts moments after the first one ends.
Yeah, so you really, it's a good practice to do that, especially with this. It makes so much sense what you just said about the fact that there's this entire like subtext, this entire world that you have to somehow narrate into like a film adaptation of a book that you said is also quite confusing and incoherent. And I felt like in Dune Part 2 that there was a lot of that context and a lot of the story that actually exceeded what was being portrayed on screen. And I could tell that there was a lot of effort put into trying to incorporate that for people maybe who are new to it, like me, or people who hadn't read the books or just didn't know the lore or the context. And while I appreciate that, I feel like it made the movie really uh, too intense in the sense that it was literally just like scene after scene after scene after scene after scene after scene after scene of like all of this stuff happening constantly. And there were even moments, a lot of moments where, like they would be like riding a giant worm heading south, and then all of a sudden you would splice in the next scene to Paul Atreides talking to his mom, and you're just meant to surmise as an audience member, like, oh, they must have arrived safely, even though the Harnikins are like on their tail. What's their name? Harkonnen. There's an extra syllable. There's an extra K in there. The Harkonnens are on their tails, and so I was like, I feel like this movie is trying to balance between people who are like in the know about all of this stuff and people who don't know anything and are just trying to enjoy a really good fantasy movie. Um, and I felt personally like they put a lot more effort into moving really trying to cover as much ground as possible with the plot. And I really don't feel like there was very much character development. And that this is the reason why, right? Because you say that like film two picks up at the very end of film one. Like the whole movie takes place in Arrakis. And like you're told that there's like you find out that no, there aren't 50,000 Fremen. There's like millions of Fremen. And like there are like differences in Fremen. There's like really fundamentalist Fremen, and there's like the free Fremen of the North. That Paul Atreides, Zendaya is like one of the free Fremen of the North. And so I guess I was just expecting to really get a deep dive into the Fremen and like to have those characters become much more complex in part two. And I gotta be honest, like, I mean, yes, it was like a very Fremen forward, it was a very indigenous forward movie, but I still don't feel like I got a really strong sense because just like Dances with Wolves, all of the Fremen characters were narrated only in their relationship to like the development of Paul Atreides, just like Kevin Costner in Dances with Wolves. And so all any of their character development or the things we find out about them is only in relationship to this, to like the coming of the Messiah figure, and whether or not they liked it or they believed it and all of those things. And so I even found, I don't know, like when we get a glimpse into the world of the Fremen, like their underworld or underground kind of existence, the sources of water that they find sacred, the way that they tame worms and get the poison or the water of life, how they do that. That stuff was like cool, but I don't know. It felt really two dimensional still. I'm not gonna lie. I was like, cool, you guys ride giant worms. Like, I don't know. I would just really love to see them like hang out with the worms more and like their interspecies relationality. I don't know. Do you get what I'm saying? Am I okay?
No, absolutely. Like the Fremen are the most interesting of the whole of all of the different groups. And you have like um, you have you have important characterizations or characters in, and the only ones you really see are Harkonnen and Atreides, which you have the fundamentalist Fremen and you have the northern Fremen, but you don't ever get like individual characters.
And the most developed one is Zendaya's character. What's her name? Chani? Chani?
Chani, yeah.
Chani. Who I don't know, is my favorite character, I guess, coming out of part two. Just because she's like, I'm a free ass Indian on free ass land. I ain't gonna call anyone my president, I ain't gonna call anyone my emperor. She's like, I don't care that I love you, and then she just walks away. At the end of part two.
Tells off Stilgar too, who's like the big chief, and yeah, she actually ends up being the only one. I mean, even Stilgar, like you when you first see him in the first movie, you think he's kind of badass. You think he's large and in charge, and he's gonna like be a mentor or something to Paul and Jessica. And then by the second movie, he's kind of simpering. Like he is all about the Messiah, and he thinks, he believes that Paul is a Lisan al Gaib. So that becomes front and center for him. He stops being an individual character, an individual leader. He stops being, in my opinion, interesting, and he becomes this like simpering idiot. And Chani becomes this strong character. And at one point in the movie, she even says to him, "But you're not Fremen. Like you can't be Fremen." Which was I think a really interesting point in that film, because it immediately I started thinking, yeah, I mean, I don't care how blue your eyes get, dude. You are not Fremen. You were not born Fremen. You are not culturally Fremen. And that to me was the point where I said, yeah, she's the best character in the whole thing.
Right? She's the only one who like holds him accountable for his, you know, settlerness. And he's also like a highborn or whatever. He comes from the aristocracy of the Atreides family. He like inherits this entire planet, and then he just goes to like live with the natives in order to learn their ways, just so he can like become the emperor of the entire presumed universe. I'm like, sick, please. Like, can we just please have a different story for once? Of this like white guy, this interloper coming in and I don't know, like going on a vision quest. That's because he did that, and then he learns how to like ride the worms, and then
Yep.
he learns like the language of the ways, and then he
And
gets
of
an
course, he
Indian
rides the
name.
worms. He rides the worms better than any of the Fremen because um, he's the Messiah. And then there's like, and when you see, so in the first film, and there's flashbacks in the second film also, but in the first film, you see, you see where the Atreides palace, and you see they're a water power. They are um, they inhabit a planet that looks very much like Great Britain. So they
You're
are
right. It's super
um,
European,
yeah,
Western
they're
European.
totally European, and and they throw in, like, I remember some of the murals on the walls of the palace had bulls, like bullfighting, which of course is not British, but you still got the idea this is definitely Western European. And Caladan as a planet is naval and air strong. They have huge armies, and that's the reason why the Padishah emperor fears them, because they're getting too strong and they could overthrow him or whatever. So there's all this sort of subplot going on about imperialism and the fear of being overthrown by another royal family. And then you never do really see Getty Prime, which is where the Harkonnens are from, but you well, you do see it when Fade is in that Colosseum and he's fighting, but you mostly experience the Harkonnens through the Baron, and he's this like gross, deformed, awful looking guy whose name is Vladimir. So there you've got your Soviets right there. And
Exactly right.
yep. Interesting when I was sort of going down the Soviet path, and you see the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen, and then our first glimpse of Fade Routha, um, the the film switches to black and white. And I thought it was beautifully done, but I'm thinking as I'm watching this in the theater, okay, so what why did they do that? Why did they switch to black and white? And then I was thinking, it pretty much follows the old sort of Soviet. When you see old films of the Soviet Union from the 60s and 70s, they're all in
Oh,
black and white.
yeah.
It's interesting.
No, I actually hadn't even thought about the way that the Harkonnens. I mostly was just thinking about the way the Fremen were representing, and like the analogy to uh like the real life kind of racialization of indigenous people, but probably also like Arab people, just the Orientalism and like the anti-Indianism that is baked into the imperial and the colonial imaginary that Herbert, the writer, I'm assuming Herbert, has constructed based on these things. Like Tolkien used a lot of imperial and colonial imagery when constructing Middle Earth and the different species and characters that populate those stories. But you're right, the Harkonnens are, I think they are caricatures of communists, or like Soviet Union specifically. And they're portrayed as like brute force. They also are very two-dimensional, actually. I mean, I was glad to see a new character, a new Harkonnen protagonist come out, but he was like worse than the other ones, actually. They're just very like misogynist, just violent, disgusting, power hungry, two-dimensional people. I mean, they literally all look the same. They're just all bald, and they're all like whitish gray, and they're always dressed in black or something.
Yeah, they're all monochromatic.
That's the
Like,
word.
yeah,
They're
they're black
monochromatic.
and white and gray. There's no color. And I think that's how a lot of people in the 60s and 70s, at the height of the Cold War, I think that's how a lot of people viewed the Soviets. Like, there was, and to be fair, a lot of the Soviet Union is gray a lot of the time. But it became one of these sort of distinguishing characteristics of the Soviets, that there was a lot of black and white and gray and not a lot of color, which is, yeah, it's weird. The Fremen, like, the other thing is, you look at like House Atreides, and you look at um, House Harkonnen, and they do seem to fit the science fiction, um, the bill. Like they have weaponry, they have technology that seems more futuristic. But then when you go and look at the Fremen, and they're living underground in these sieges, and they're cooking over open fires, and they're the way they're dressed looks very primitive, and they're definitely um, considered to be more primitive, or more, there's that otherness about the Fremen that you don't get with the other houses. And I mean, I would have read it completely as indigenous anywhere. I mean, they could be Palestinian, they could be, um, you know, Lakota, they could be Dene. But when they start speaking Arabic, that immediately, positions them. And a lot of people have basically just read Arrakis as Iraq, which is interesting. But the spice, of course, as oil, um, and that fits into the whole colonial imperialism and the whole Lawrence of Arrakis idea. But the Fremen also have, like, they have been religiously colonized on such a level. Like, they have their own beliefs, but those beliefs, you come to learn, were planted by the Bene Gesserits. And the Bene Gesserits are, you also sort of come to see, are not this benevolent organization that helps the underdogs fight, but they're like literal masters of eugenics, and they're breeding the Kwisatz Haderach, and that's what Paul is supposed to become. But then the part that I find interesting and more complicated is that Jessica, as a Bene Gesserit, and the Reverend Mother acknowledge that they created this idea of the Kwisatz Haderach, or the Messiah, in order to control the houses. So it's not even a real thing. It's a made up myth that then the Fremen, or at least Stilgar and his group in the north, and the fundamentalist group in the south, have bought into lock, stock, and barrel. So there's this idea not only of imperialism and colonialism for resource extraction, but there's this religious colonialism. And the Fremen can't remove themselves from that level of colonialism because they've bought into it so deeply. Does that make sense?
No, it totally does. You're blowing my mind again because I was thinking like the Bene Gesserit felt a lot like Catholicism or something, in the way that they dress, and the veils that they wear, and just like the draping of their dresses, and that must be some sort of commentary on the power of religion. Really, now that you're talking about this, and you're right, like the Bene Gesserit completely fabricated this idea of the Messiah in order to have like ultimate control. And you're right, they're engaged in a project of eugenics. How many generations did 90 generations or something, if I remember?
Yeah.
They've been
Yep.
breeding the Messiah. What is it called
Yep.
again? The
Kwisatz
Kis-
Haderach.
Huizat Haderach.
Yep.
Haderach? Yeah. Who's supposed to be Paul Atreides for the folks who don't know. Paul Atreides is like the main character of the movies or of the story, and that would track, I think, in terms of like the way that religion has played such a central role in imperial and colonial control and expansion and consolidation. Because if I think about it, Chani, which is Zendaya's character, is an atheist, actually, right? She's an
That
atheist.
she does not
And
believe.
she doesn't believe in anything, from what I can tell. She has this line. I forgot. Oh, now I'm trying to remember. She has this really powerful line, or her and her friend, when they're like laughing at Stilgar and the other Fremen from the south who are believers, who believe in like the prophecy or whatever of the coming of this Messiah, and who are very fundamentalist and who have obviously very taken with the religion that has been spread by the Bene Gesserit amongst the Fremen of the south. And they're all just like laughing. And I forgot what they said. It wasn't like we follow ourselves or like we follow our own path, or they said something to that effect. But I feel like they probably represent in the mind of Herbert, the person who created this world, as like the atheists. And I mean, I called them earlier like the free ass Indians. But yeah,
Yeah, and they're like the counterbalance to the the misogyny that is so rampant through that film. And I mean, the Fremen basically are a patriarchal society. The only difference is that the women are fighters; they fight as well. But other than that, they're led completely by men, which is not unlike Islam. And um, Chani herself even wears, I mean, it's not really a headscarf, but it's close to a headscarf. It makes sense environmentally because they're in the desert.
actually, I think I went to go see it with a good friend, and she pointed out something that I did not understand. A, because I haven't read the books, but I think this was one of those like subtextual things that I did not see in the movie, just because the movie goes through so many things. It moves really fast through a lot of stuff. But it's actually the mom, Lady Jessica, Rebecca Ferguson's character. She's pregnant with a daughter, Paul Atreides' younger sister, and then she like gets yoded. She drinks like the water of life, the worm juice, the blue worm juice, um, while she's pregnant. And then after she comes out of that, she survives that, and then she becomes the Reverend Mother. She's like having conversations with her daughter, her unborn daughter, her fetus, essentially. And you get like these weird shots at times of the fetus or like growing inside of her. And I think it's the daughter who becomes the Kwisatz Haderach, not Paul Atreides. I think it's the daughter. And my friend pointed this out to me, and I was like, oh, I didn't even realize this, because she was like, oh, it was actually the daughter in utero who's like directing the mother to do all of these, to manipulate all of these things so that Paul Atreides can become the new emperor. And so actually the implication is that it's actually the daughter who is the final boss, the thing that the Bene Gesserit has been trying to produce for 90 generations.
Yeah, Alia is the daughter, and she you see a shot in the at the end of the second movie. It's Anya Taylor Joy, who I think is fabulous, who's going to, I hope, portray Alia. But Alia, due to Jessica's drinking the water of life, she is born with all of the knowledge and skills of a Mother Superior of the Bene Gesserit order. So she develops all of those skills in utero. And yeah, so um, she is directing Jessica, and she becomes something. The Kwisatz Haderach in the books has to be a man, which is
Oh,
why
okay.
which, which is why in the first movie when Helen Mohim, the Mother Superior Helen Mohim, goes to Paul and she puts the Gom Jabbar up against his neck and he says, this will kill animals. Um, and he says, "Are you calling the son of a duke an animal?" And she says, "We will see." Um, but she's testing him to see if he can rise above his animal instincts or whatever the test is. And she says to Jessica, "You were supposed to bear the duke only daughters, because we could have married one of those to a Harkonnen's son. Um, and she says it was your arrogance that made you think you could produce the Kwisatz Haderach. But it's weird, and I never quite figured out they're talking about this, and yet both of them are fully cognizant of the fact that this is a made up thing. Like they have, the Bene Gesserits have made this all up, and yet they're talking about it like it's a real thing. So that always confused me. But in the books, the Kwisatz Haderach has to be um, a boy, has to be a male child. And then the other thing, which is honest to God kind of fucked up, is that Jessica is the daughter of Baron Harkonnen.
Right, you find that
So
out.
you find that out, and if you like are thinking about that, the Bene Gesserits wanted her to have a child to be married to one of his nephews, which, I mean, we know the royal families of Europe did it all the time, but you're talking a little incest there. You're talking about marrying people who are related to one another. So, if the imperialism and resource extraction wasn't enough to convince you that these are all based on European royal families, boy, the incest will get you.
Telltale sign right there.
Yep.
I want to talk a little bit more about Lady Jessica. Um, our comrade Demetrius, he described it. He was like, "Yeah, she was like the story. If you all listened to the episode that comrade Jen and Justine did 3 weeks or 4 weeks ago, where they were talking about this series called Mother God. It's like this new age cult, but they were just talking about like kind of like new ageism amongst kind of like the settler right in the United States. But they were describing this experience with this white buffalo calf woman who came to a Red Nation event and then accosted our other comrade Nick, who's Lakota, and she claimed to be like she'd taken so much peyote that she claimed to be white buffalo calf woman, which is, I don't know, she's thinking like she's kind of like this messiah, this Lakota messiah, and then we kicked her out of the event. But for that nonsense. But so Jen and Justine tell this story. But anyway, Lady Jessica's basically the same in this movie. And Dee said, it's like she was just like the white buffalo calf woman of Arrakis or whatever, right? So she just gets extremely yoded on the worm juice, the water of life, and then of course, because her daughter's in utero, her daughter gets extremely yoded, and so the two of them just get really yoded, and then she becomes this high priestess of the order essentially. And then she like, I know, tattoos her face and just becomes like incredibly creepy. And it's just like utilizing the spiritual power that she gets from indigenous people to basically like overthrow them, but also to like overthrow the empire. Um, and yeah, so she just like, she also herself is this creepy interloper. She really is just a new ager. She just comes in and she uses like indigenous spirituality to just like gain power. And Paul does the same thing. He literally just goes native in order to like have this, to intensify his like visions, and then he goes on the vision quest, and then he like rides the worm, and then he finds out he's part Harkonnen, and then all of a sudden he becomes a monster. At the end of the movie, and I'm just like, and then he just like does Chani dirty, and then she leaves him, and because he just uses her. He's like, I love you at the very end, and then he turns around and he then turns to the emperor's daughter, and he's like, but I will marry you. Because he's just interested in power. And
But I want you to wait for me in the bedroom when I'm done siring an heir on this emperor's daughter. Yeah.
it's just sick. So like the way that indigenous people are just used for like the raw material, the raw resource of Arrakis spice is mined to be used because the most it's the most valuable thing in the entire universe because they can't do like intergalactic space travel, isn't that what they said, without spice. And so their homelands are mined, right, for this value so that these like high houses and these high planets can play their war games for like the ultimate like conquering of the universe and the empire. But then also the Atreides, like Jessica and Paul, both just use the Fremen and their indigenous knowledge also to just like Game of Thrones their shit with the other high houses. It's really it's disturbing. I That's what it is about Dune. I hate the story. The story of Dune sucks so bad. It's so racist. It's so racist and misogynist. And so I have a hard time watching the movie because I'm like, this story sucks. Like the character of Paul Atreides is disgusting. His mom is like creepy as fuck. I don't like any of these white people doing all this crazy stuff. But at the same time, it's like very beautifully shot. But anyway, that's how I feel
It is
about
beautifully
Dune.
shot. It is, and um, the world that they created cinematographically, the world they created, yeah,
Cinematographically.
yes, that word is gorgeous. Um, and you get like I think three quarters through the movie, Paul is you see him trying to fight against becoming the Kwisatz Haderach. He doesn't want it. He wants the Fremen to be free, and he's saying that to his mother. And he's saying, I don't want this. I want the Fremen basically to have sovereignty, to have autonomy, and self determination." And then there's another point where his mother is trying to convince him that the only way they're going to have that is if he leads them against the empire, the emperor. And the only way he can successfully do that is if he becomes the Kwisatz Haderach. So then there's a point where he sort of accepts that, but he still believes in Fremen autonomy and Fremen independence. And then he goes all to hell. And yeah, he tastes the power, the water of life, and he becomes this. He becomes what he beheld. Essentially, he turns into the emperor, and um, and that's when Chani basically, and I don't know what's, I mean, I know what happens in the book, but I don't know what's going to happen in the movie, in the third movie. But she turns away from him at the end of the second movie, and she's disgusted, and she's rightly disgusted. And I think she's rightly disgusted by literally everybody, because Stilgar, who talked about when he shows Paul and Jessica the Seaches and all the water, and he says, with this we can transform the face of Arrakis. And what he wants, at least at that point in the film, is they want to flood Arrakis and create this planet that can support life. And you see, he says we have thousands of these Seaches all over. So they're looking environmentally at reclaiming their planet and not having so much emphasis on spice, because of course the Fremen don't really want to go anywhere. They don't want to bend space. They don't need spice the way that the Empire needs spice. So they want their planet back. They want their land. They want their land back. And that's what you get in the beginning. And then as the movie goes on, and Paul gets power hungry, and he's egged on by his mother and his unborn baby sister, and all the Bene Gesserits. Then it changes, and it becomes this just colonial, settler colonialism and imperialism and resource extraction. And you realize that Paul has turned that corner, and he's never going back.
Yep. And Chani's like the conscience, like the anti-colonial or like the commentary on that turn. She's an indigenous woman. She's played by a black woman. Um, and that's not a coincidence. And she's, you know, She's the one with the best ethics in the entire story. Yep. She carries like a strong commitment and a memory of freedom, like true freedom, that nobody else seems to have. Um, yeah, at all in the story.
Community. I mean, she talks about her people, and you never get that sense um, with. That's why it's just like imperialism on steroids. I mean, you don't like even with even with Paul Atreides and even with his father, who was supposed to be the good guy. Um, they never talk about the people on Caladan or what's best for the people. They talk about the house of Atreides, which is only the family. It's only the elite of the elite. And you never see like the you never see the populations of people that inhabit any of these other planets. All you see are are the royal families, and Chani's the only one who talks about her people and the community of Fremen. So they're like this lone population that is seeking autonomy and independence and land back against every other planet in the known universe.
I was also thinking at the end when he does that turn, when he just becomes basically a monster who wants to take over the empire. I'm like, dang, so this is just a story about some white dude, like a one percenter who like slums it for a while with these indigenous people of the desert, and he like falls in love with this indigenous woman, and then he like engages in like radical resistance with them when they're like trying to take down the machinery that's trying to extract the spice. But then I'll, of course, he does not become a class traitor at all. He does it for a short period of time, and then once he finds out that he can actually have power, he just immediately abandons it. And then he convinces those people with his mom to fight against like the emperor and House Harkonnen with him, and then he's just like, yeah, I'm the emperor now.
Yeah, so you don't get your planet back because I'm going to keep mining spice and keep abusing the planet and keep the Fremen as lower class workers. They're the proles, and he's going to direct them and own them and use them, but forget about all this idea of autonomy and sovereignty and transforming the face of Arrakis. Now that I have control of spice, it's mine, all mine. Yeah, it's really very depressing at the end of that movie. And then he kills his cousin.
That's true. Although that guy was an asshole.
Well,
He
that's true.
defeated the Soviet Union
He did.
in the
He did.
movie.
Yep.
And see, like, I don't know, even what we're describing here, am I shocked? No. Is it a fictional portrayal of imperialism? Yeah. But like, I don't know. I this might be an unpopular opinion, but I think it's just a stupid story. I don't care about some spindly legged white boy's rise to imperial power. Like cape, like epic cape moments, or not. Like I don't know. The whole story just feels very silly to me. And I guess most fantasy and science fiction stories are pretty much always about imperialism and colonialism and racism, um, and like misogyny, because they pretty much are, and homophobia, like all of them. Like Game of Thrones is all of those things, for example, to choose a very famous example. But yeah, I don't know. It all feels a bit two dimensional. That's what Dune. It's just like a bunch of characters that become caricatures of probably the kinds of like imperial and colonial configurations that were very prominent at the time that Herbert was writing these novels. Because it was like in the 70s, right?
Yeah, the first one came out in 65, and then there are
Oh,
six
even earlier.
total. They get weirder. I mean, the first one was probably the easiest to read, just because the characters and the history and the world itself was new. But as you go on, they get weirder. Well, like the next one, so the first two movies were basically just Dune, the first book, and then the third one, which I understand they've already greenlit, um, is Dune Messiah. And then you get Son of Dune, Children of Dune. Um, yeah, and they get weirder. Like there is sort of a redemption arc for Paul Atreides, um, but the imperialist theme does not go away, and it's also like um, the the Fremen become less important, which to me, that when I read the first book, that like seemed to be the goal, which was to free the Fremen and transform the face of Arrakis. And that sort of gets lost somewhere in all the imperial um, celebrations. And yeah, it's a disappointment.
Yeah, I maybe people don't read like the indigeneity in Dune the same way I did. Because the only reason I was really interested in watching it was because it felt very indigenous, or at least like the Fremen feel very indigenous, or at least that's the analog, I guess, the reference for the writer. So I kind of only cared about watching it because I wanted to see what was going to happen with the indigenous people. So if you're telling me that like they become yet again just part of the backdrop, like there's significance to the larger plot of the white man, that significance has already faded into the background. I don't really care to watch the rest of the movies, to be honest. I just
I'd love to see more focus on like the Fremen and their relationship with the worms, because there's clearly they are relatives, and that's where you get the indigeneity in that film. Is the worms to them aren't scary like they are to the colonizers, because the colonizers are extracting um, spice, and the worms don't like it. The worms are um, relatives. You can see that when they ride the worms down to the south, that they have a relationship, and they have a reciprocal relationship with the worms. And that is actually discussed more in the books, but you don't see that. Like they remove that whole aspect of the Fremen from the films, and that to me indigenizes the Fremen even more. Like you can read them as more indigenous in the books than you can in the movies, because I think the filmmakers just didn't care. They were all about
exactly.
the houses. They were all about the imperialism and the splendor and the grandeur and all of this crap, which to me was the most uninteresting part of it.
I agree. That's what I'm saying. Like, I really wanted to see into the world of like who the Fremen are. Like, how do you have such a like an how do you turn like a giant worm into your homie? Like they were even talking about night spirits. Um, like when Paul went out to do his vision quest thing and like don't talk to the night spirits, and I'm like, talk more about that. Like there are night spirits out in the sand. That's dope. Like that sounds very indigenous to me. And so anyway, I just wanted to hear more about the indigenous people, especially because like the entire story takes place in their homelands, and they're obviously like the most oppressed people in the entire universe.
Yeah, and talk about the water. Like when Stilgar is talking about the water in the Sitges, and he says, "We don't drink any of this. This is sacred water." And then it stops. Like that whole explanation. That's it. That's all you get. Like, tell us about that.
I actually found like the coolest thing that happened in Dune Part 2 was when they were relocating from the north to the south. And like I don't understand how they communicated with the worms, but like the whole ass siege was on the back of these worms. I mean, this is probably like hundreds, if not thousands of people are traveling, like the worms are their trains or whatever, their form of transportation. And I was like, this is like a worm highway. This is totally dope. This is by far the coolest thing I'm seeing in this entire movie. I wish they would actually explain it instead of just doing like a 10-second like scene where you're like, oh, they're on the backs of the worms. That's cool. And then next it's just like, I don't know, you're seeing Paul Atreides in his cape again. And so I'm just like, I don't know.
Yeah, I definitely want to see the worm highways. I think that would be very cool. Like their relationship with water. I mean, what is the Fremen's relationship with water? I mean, obviously, it is huge and important. The same way it is with all indigenous peoples who live in areas like that. There are relationships with water. There are relationships with water beings, and like, tell us more about that. That would be infinitely more interesting than anything else.
But no, that that's what people might call a missed opportunity. Um
Shit, yeah.
I give a Demetrius was asking me what out of 10 sheeps what I would rate this movie, and I was like, it's like a 5 or a 6 out of 10 sheeps in my perspective.
Yeah, definitely. Um, Beautifully shot. The landscape is gorgeous. I don't know where they filmed that. Um, it looked like it could be Wadi Rum in Jordan, could be Tunisia, but I mean, it was the landscape was beautiful. I loved the land, and I thought the worms were well done. Um, so yeah, I love the worms. And there were some interesting cinematic techniques like the black and white when the Harkonnens were on. But I'd say story and character development definitely makes it 5 or 6 sheep.
Word. I got to be honest, as like a person who comes from an indigenous nation that's more or less in the desert or like the high desert, I was really hoping there would be some mountains in the movie too. I was watching like 2 hours in, I was like, what's missing? I was like, I just keep seeing sand dunes. I mean, duh. The movie is called Dune. And like I had watched the first movie, but in my like Navajo brain, I associate the desert with mountains too. It's not just sand. And so there's like rock outcroppings that they kind of like, I don't know, go to. And then the Harkonnens are also like blowing up rock outcroppings under like a lot of the sieges are underneath those are their like entry points to the underground places where they live. But I'm gonna be honest, I was really hoping to see some mountains.
It's true.
That's just my personal opinion. Would have been better with mountains. It loses half a sheep because it lacked mountains.
And it didn't have any sheep either. Even in the sand, there was no sheep. Like that. Yeah, you did have those cute little things.
There's just mice. That was the other thing. There were like no there's like no birds or really, I mean it's the desert, but yeah, it was just like the little mice. I don't even think there were insects in it. Would have just been nice to get a larger sense of the ecosystem of Arrakis, you know? The
Well,
texture of
and how did
Arrakis.
they
It was
know?
literally just sand.
Yeah. Well, and I mean, how did they know where to find water? Like, I think all of our ancestors, all of our folks who come from the desert, that was one of the ways they knew where water was, is they followed the animals or they learned from the animals. So yeah, How did the Fremen? That's another thing they need to go into. How did the Fremen find all that water?
Listen,
Damn it.
indigenous filmmakers, you need to make like a spin-off of Dune, and it should be like a show or just like a movie, and it's only about like it's all Fremen all the time. It's just about Arrakis. It's about like all the cool indigenous things that the Fremen do and their relationality with the land and the water.
And we want to see more worms.
My hot that's my hot take. Yeah. Like when the lady who was like the worm whisperer, was able to extract the blue goo from the baby worm. I was like, how do you breed worms? Like, can I see bigger worms? Because like in Game of Thrones, it's something akin to like the Targaryen relationship with their dragons, right? And so I feel like in Game of Thrones, the dragons are characters in Game of Thrones. And so I feel like by the end of that series, you get a really strong sense of what the dragon human relationality is and what it looks like and the lore and like how it's part of their identity as House Targaryen. And so I don't know. I would really like to see what that's like.
You learn that dragons only bond with certain people, and you learn, um, yeah, you learn dragon lore as part of the ongoing storyline. But yeah, you don't get that in Dune. You don't get the worm lore, which is sad.
Worm lore, dances with worms. No, yeah, dances with worms. No, the worms are the coolest thing in Dune. I want to see more
Well, and
human
they
worm
use
relationality.
the worm teeth as those crysknives, which are, I mean, Chani gives one to Paul Atreides and says, "My grandmother gave me this, and it, it's sacred to me, and it's made from a worm tooth. So, how do they get the crysknives, and how are they passed down, and what do they use them for, and what do they mean? Like, we never got, you just got these little side comments, but we never learned anything more about them.
Oh, see, I feel like there's probably a comment in the movie about that, but that went completely over my head. Like I failed to realize the Chris knives were actually worm teeth. Yeah, see, do they communicate with the worms? They must in some way, shape, or form.
Well, and they call them using the thumpers, but then how do they, like when they were all heading south on the worms, how do they tell them where they want to go?
Exactly, because the worms knew. The worms knew. They were like rolling like six deep, and they had like thousands of Fremen on their backs, and they were all going to the same place. How did they know that? How did they communicate that to them? They didn't just like put their hooks in there and ride them through the sand. Like that's the kind of thing I would like to see more of.
We need, yeah, indigenous filmmakers. We need a movie about the worms and the Fremen.
Yeah, and Chani should be the protagonist of that movie because Chani's pretty badass.
Yeah, Johnny definitely badass.
Well, that's all I have to say about Dune 2.
Yeah, I think we pretty much covered it. Kind of disappointed.
I I for one, speaking about another movie, I know we're at like a little over an hour. We should probably wrap up. But I am very excited to see the new Kong versus Gorilla movie. Gorilla. I keep saying Kong versus Gorilla. Kong versus Godzilla movie. I'm like so excited. We did a podcast episode like 4 years ago, 5 years ago. Do you remember this? We had this like large screening, all the Red Nation people. And I remember I still have people who come up to me today who are like, do you guys really think that like the Kong versus Godzilla movies are political? And we're like, yes.
Oh my god, how could you be? How could you be like not? The fact that Godzilla is created from nuclear waste. I mean, how could you not be political? Um, and we had sides too. I mean, we had teams. There was Team Godzilla and there was Team Kong.
We felt really strongly about it. We fought about it. And yeah, even today, people still are just like, that podcast was hilarious. I can't believe you guys did a political analysis of that movie. And I'm like, yeah. Also, there's another Planet of the Apes movie coming out. And we've never done a review of Planet of the Apes on RPH, but way back, when did the first one come out? Like 2014, 2015, or like at least a decade ago, right? Because we're on our fourth Planet of the Apes, at least the newer versions. I did a whole like takedown, not a takedown, but I did an analysis of the settler colonialism on Facebook. I still had Facebook at that time, and I did a whole analysis, and people were like really into it. They're like, "This is cool. We haven't heard anyone talk about Planet of the Apes this way." They're like, "You should write something about this." And I was like, "Well," and then I never did. But the genesis of my desire to do kind of like indigenous critical reviews of films came from Planet of the Apes. So I would love for us to do a review of Planet of the Apes.
Well, and if we're going to do Planet of the Apes, we got to go back to the original ones. And
And then
I
watch
remember,
the Mark Wahlberg ones.
yep, yep, yep. My dad loved those movies, those old movies. I remember watching it when I was a kid, and like they scared me. But for some reason he got a kick out of them. I need to go back and watch them because I bet I could figure out why he was so amused um, by those films. But yeah, those are some intense films. And um, like I saw the ad for the new Kong Godzilla, and there's more Kongs. There's like more Kongs, and there's a line on it that says, "And we thought he was the last one, or we thought he was the only one." There's more Kongs.
Hell yeah. That's what I like to hear.
Oh yeah. So I was on Team Godzilla, and Godzilla was like my guy or girl. Because I don't know, is Godzilla gendered?
I mean, I gender Godzilla. I was in my analysis of the last Godzilla Kong movie. I thought that Godzilla was just like a badass woman.
Okay, yeah, I was always Team Godzilla, and I think we even argued about who won because it was never really quite clear.
Well, that actually will be really fun. I'm looking forward to seeing both the Planet of the Apes and the new Godzilla Kong movie. Maybe we should watch some like fancy intellectual things too, but that's not why I go to the movies.
No, no,
That's my profession.
exactly. I read enough of that. I want to go. I go I watch movies to disconnect from reality. I don't need any more reality than there is.
Yeah, this hellscape. Um, well, cool. Thanks for listening, everyone.
We are going to do an Ask Me Anything episode sometime in the next few weeks. So if you have some questions you want to ask us, you need to join the Patreon, which you can do for as little as $5 a month, $2 a month, $3. What is
Too.
it? Two? Okay, $2 a month. Send your questions in, and we will answer them as best we can.
Cool. Okay, we'll be back in a couple of weeks with another Red Power Hour episode. Thanks, everyone, for listening.